went wrong and what can still go right. As you all know, we have been suffering from the pandemic. The entire world is facing a war-like situation. We are in Isaac also having a lot of discussion on the COVID. Last July, we had a panel discussion on COVID and rural economy. Also, we had some policy papers on the COVID situation. In our webinar series since last 1 year, this is being 13th lecture, so last 12 lectures we had discussed various issues, economic and social issues related to various aspects. I thought it is high time we need to discuss the pandemic, especially the second wave, which is going on, and we all are suffering. The pandemic has affected all continents. If we see the history, there has been around 170 million cases confirmed at the global level, and 3.5 million deaths have been reported as per the data of World Health Organization. The two largest countries affected by COVID, the speaker comes from USA, where 32.9 million cases and 589,000 deaths have occurred. And we are the second sufferer with 28.2 million cases and 332,000 deaths. So this is a very big number. And now we are the danger of third wave. Already I was looking at the headlights today in the newspaper. It says already UK, the third wave is arriving. So the only way we can meet the COVID, we can overcome the situation is vaccination. If we see again the global data on vaccination, around 1.6 billion vaccination doses have been administered globally, out of which India has around 114 million vaccines, 11.4 crore vaccine doses across the country. If we just see globally, 5.5% of the global population has been fully vaccinated. India stands 3.2%. Compared to India, USA has 41.2%, UK 38%, and Brazil 10.5%. So at least to cover 10%, India has a long distance to cover. We are way behind, and the situation is so dangerous that our government had to cancel the examination of senior secondary schools. Yesterday it was declared because we don't have enough number of vaccines to vaccinate students in the age of say at least 18 to 45, which is opened up, but it was opened up from the 1st May, but we are falling short. We don't have vaccine, and there is a war-like situation going on with the central government and state governments and various state governments. There is no centralized system. This time the central government asked the states to procure vaccine, which has become very difficult. Most of the companies, they are not ready to give vaccine to the states. The question has come to now whether the union government will initiate steps or states have to struggle like that. So it is a very appropriate time to have a scientific lecture on the vaccine, on the pandemic, its impact on health of the people, and how so far we have handled the situation of pandemic, and where we have made mistake, where we have gone wrong, how we can correct our path, because it's a long way. Pandemic is not going to end immediately, So we need much more planning. We need much more definite path to cover to overcome this pandemic and bring in a situation where we can open up and we can get back to the economy. We are already 21% negative growth rate last year. The latest estimates have come, and next 2 to 3 years we are continue going to suffer. So I am very happy that Dr. Sanjay Reddy has agreed to deliver this lecture today. The people's vaccine, what went wrong and what can still go right. Before I hand over the mic to Professor Thorat to chair the lecture today, it is my humble job to introduce the speaker. Sanjay Reddy, although he is very well known, he has done a lot of work on health economics. Formally reading his CV, Sanjay Reddy is an associate professor of economics at the New School for Social Research. His areas of research interest include development economics, international economics, philosophy and economics, among other subjects. He has published very widely in academic journals in economics and related subjects and given many prominent academic lectures. His extensive publications include a co-edited book titled A Great Transformation, Understanding India's New Political Economy, which is published from Rationale. He has been a member of the advisory panel of the UNDP's Human Development Report and of the UN Statistics Division Steering Committee on Poverty Statistics. Dr. Sanjay did his PhD in economics at Harvard and MPhil in social anthropology at the University of Cambridge. So he is well versed with economics, anthropology, sociology, all the subjects, and he will be speaking today on the pandemic situation and how we can overcome. Now, I hand over the mic to Professor Thorat, and with a reminder that Professor Chandan Gowda, who had joined recently with us on the Shri Ramakrishna Hegde chair, he will be moderating today's lecture. So I will not stand between you and Dr. Sanjay. Professor Thorat will be chairing, and if he has introductory remarks, I request Professor Thorat, if he wants to come back after the lecture, then I will request Dr. Sanjay Reddy to start his lecture. Over to Professor Thorat. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I welcome Sanjay Reddy, and I also thank him for accepting our invitation of the Institute to deliver a lecture on a very important topic. I'm quite sure that your presentation will bring some insight on the present issue. I also welcome all the participants. There are about 62 of them which are directly linked. Maybe there are other links also. All of them, including some of my board members, I see here, Changappa, Indira, and others. Well, I don't have much to add. If I pass it on to Chandan Gowda to start the lecture or to make the beginning.
So, Sanjay, thank you, Professor Thorat, for those remarks. I think we should start the lecture now, and then Sanjay, over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kumar and Professor Thorat and Professor Gowda as well. It's been, well, it is really a pleasure to have been asked to speak to you this evening. I've been visiting ISEC occasionally over roughly 3 decades, so from the mid-1980s, so it's great, or late 1980s, so it's a great pleasure to be able to join you this evening, if in this new manner. I am going to speak, as was mentioned, on the topic of the people's vaccine. But I will take a broad view of what that means, including, for example, not just vaccines, though that's been how the concept has been used generally, but also all the other health commodities which are needed in order to combat COVID-19. And this includes, for instance, tests and therapeutics, which might be relevant both to identifying whether or not a person has the disease as well as, or the virus, as well as whether or not, as well as to how they are treated. I'm very glad to see a number of friends here, I should say, and well, I won't name them individually now. But one of the people who is here today is my co-author on a number of the writings on the concept of a people's vaccine that I have done over the last year. And that is Dr. Arnab Acharya, who is somewhere in the audience. And I may call upon him later in case he can help give a more expert point of view on some of the details that might come up. I have been writing with Professor Acharya on the concept of a people's vaccine from the middle of last year. Professor Acharya, independently from me, wrote a blog post, a couple of them, which advocated the people's vaccine in the middle of last year when it was hardly a subject of public discussion. I had also been thinking about it, and we came together to write a longer, more analytical piece advocating a people's vaccine in September. And that was, of course, even before India and South Africa had put together and advanced their joint proposal for a waiver of the customary intellectual property rights protections, a TRIPS waiver in the World Trade Organization, which they did in early October. So we have really been focusing on the issue from the beginning, or from very early on in this debate, and have been trying to grapple with the various issues and arguments. I should say we have not been a part of the larger, or at least not very intimately or very directly, of the larger constellation of non-governmental organizations and activists who have been pushing for a people's vaccine, which is also something that emerged rather later in the year, after we had begun our initial work. Oxfam, Médecins Sans Frontières, and a number of other international non-governmental organizations have been at the forefront, ActionAid, of that work. And of course, it has also been taken up by millions, tens of millions of ordinary people. The phrase people's vaccine emerged from that activist constellation. What is a people's vaccine? Let me first define it and then explain what is the economic and social case for a people's vaccine, and then go briefly into the difficulties that were encountered, the present situation, and how it is that the remaining obstacles could potentially still be addressed. First of all, as to what it is. Broadly speaking, the idea of a people's vaccine, and again here I include a very much larger range of relevant health commodities, including tests and therapeutics, is of a vaccine which is available universally to all people in the world at no cost or at very low and accessible cost. The rationale for a people's vaccine is straightforward, and it consists of two elements. One, broadly, I would say, one is the idea that health is a human right, and that to the extent that a vaccine can provide protection against a dangerous illness, either directly or indirectly, to those other people in the community who are vulnerable, it is essential that it should be available to all. But the other is that the universal or nearly universal availability of such a vaccine is likely to have instrumental consequences which are quite substantial. We can think, for instance, of the massive disruptions of social life, for instance, of schooling, which was mentioned in the discussion that took place briefly before we began this this session today, recalling the cancellation of the CBSE examinations this year in India. Massive disruptions of schooling, massive disruptions of various social processes and interactions, including family life and community life, with enormous consequences for all, but also economic consequences which are extremely grave. We know, for instance, that India in particular suffered an enormous contraction of its national economy, but it is not alone in that. And the world economy as a whole suffered an unprecedented contraction, which is likely to be overcome only in a matter of years. With the latest projections of the point at which the world economy will return to its size prior to the pandemic being some point in 2022, likely late 2022. So we have massive economic consequences as well as the social disruptions which are encountered. These are among the indirect or instrumental concerns which motivate a people's vaccine, quite apart from the primary concerns that involve the direct effects on human beings and the direct claims which they can reasonably make. The narrative, of course, can be extended further. We have increasingly the issue of new variants, which has come up, and the rollout of a people's vaccine, if one had been available on a widespread basis, would have presumably combated, perhaps even prevented, the emergence of new variants, which are more likely to emerge to the extent that there are more hosts in which the vaccine is circulating who provide opportunities and encouragement for mutation. So from this standpoint as well, the universal or nearly universal availability of a vaccine and in an accessible form would have had enormous advantages from a health standpoint, but also from a social and an economic standpoint. So that's one layer of the argument. Let me present one more layer, which is the idea that a vaccine is a global public good. And in what sense do I mean this? I think there's a lot of confusion about this. I will elaborate this a little bit. A global public good is a public good which is global in nature. And a public good is a good which classically, according to economists, has two features. It is, and here I'm going a little bit more into the theory as opposed to the initial motivation. And those two features are non-rivalrousness and non-excludability. Non-rivalrousness means that a public good can be enjoyed by all. One person enjoying the good, the public good, does not decrease its availability or its usefulness to another person. So there's no element of competition which is involved between persons where public good is concerned. Second, non-excludability. Once a public good is in place, it is not possible to prevent people from enjoying it. This is at least the classical definition of a public good. And without elaborating the argument in great detail, let me just note that the economic theory of public goods tells us that the efficient level of provision of a public good is typically as high as possible, but will not be attained, at least after comparing the social costs of provisioning of the public good and the social benefits of provisioning the public good. But that will not be attained to the extent that there is a so-called free rider problem in which those who cannot be excluded also do not contribute as much as is required in order to provide the efficient level of production. That having been said, public goods are very often provided to some extent despite that problem because of the role of government and of the value of cooperation, which is recognized and which is undertaken by members of the community. So we have a clear-cut case for provisioning of public goods, which is present even though there are often challenges in encountering or bringing about the efficient level of provision. In what sense is a vaccine a public good? Well, let's approach this in two ways. First, consider the formula for a vaccine. The formula for a vaccine, once it is present, once it has been hit upon, is non-rivalrous in the sense that for one person or one community, one society, to benefit from the use of that formula does not decrease the ability of others also to similarly benefit. Okay, so there is no inherent conflict in the use of that formula across different persons. So that's a clear sense of non-rivalrousness. What about non-excludability? Well, this is a little bit more tricky because in principle, one could exclude others from possessing or benefiting from a formula. And when you have non-rivalrousness, but you have excludability, that's partway toward a pure public good. It's what's called a club good. So one could argue that in practice, the formula for a vaccine is more along the lines of a club good than a public good, but nevertheless, there are public good characteristics. And there would be a clear case for treating such a good as a public good by making the formula freely accessible from the standpoint that indeed there is no competition or rivalrousness in use, which would again lead to, therefore, a higher level of social good to be attained by allowing the formula to be made free access to and used by all. What about the level of population health which is attained as a result, and population immunity which is attained as a result of the application of the vaccine? This is another angle from which one can analyze the public good characteristics that are associated with the vaccine. Here, once more, it's clear that there is non-rivalrousness. My ability to benefit from the fact that other people are vaccinated does not in any way hinge upon or diminish your ability to benefit from the fact that other people are vaccinated. So to the extent that vaccination diminishes transmission of the virus, there is and also, of course, reduces the knock-on consequences of the disease existing in the society. There is a clear non-rivalrousness in our ability, respectively, to benefit from other people having been vaccinated or inoculated. And I think in this case, much more clearly than in the case of the vaccine formula, there is also non-excludability. It is not possible for me to prevent you from benefiting from the fact that third parties are vaccinated and vice versa. So this has very much more of the pure public good characteristics. So I think from both of these points of view, it's quite clear that the efficient level of production of the public good is as high as possible, as is typically the case, after taking account of all of the relevant costs. Now, what are those costs? Those costs are of two kinds. One is the research and development cost, and the second is the variable cost or the marginal cost of providing the vaccine to individuals. Largely, the cost is a research and development cost. The variable cost of providing the vaccine to individuals is relatively low, and I won't give exact numbers here, but here we're talking essentially of the cost of production and distribution, as well as application of the vaccine jabs in arms, I think, is the phrase which is used in some of the public health literature, getting those jabs into the arms. There is a marginal cost to that, but that's relatively low as compared with the cost of research and development, one could argue. In any case, there would also be a case for subsidy of these production and distribution and application costs, insofar as there are knock-on consequences and negative externalities of various kinds associated with the continued circulation of the virus and prevalence of the disease, as I have argued. Is there any sense in which the public good analogy does not apply even partially? Well, I think the primary sense in which that's true is from the standpoint of the individual pharmaceutical companies, as opposed to society at large. Because to the extent that the individual pharmaceutical companies can benefit from having exclusive intellectual property rights protections and the ability to market their product, there is an element of rivalrousness between companies, which is present, and of course the excludability that exists arises as a result of the protection by governments of these supposed intellectual property rights and their exclusive rights of marketing and distribution, which they would like to see therefore protected, and which clearly to some extent are present. So there is rivalrousness and there is excludability, at least to the degree that the state is in support of these rights from the standpoint of individual companies. Okay, so I think having parsed the problem in this way, we can see that there is a clear variation in the perspective of society at large and in the perspective of the private sector actors concerned. Now, if there is a global public goods aspect to vaccines, certainly a national public goods aspect, but also, I think, quite clearly a global public goods aspect, why is it that they have not been treated as such in their production and their distribution? Now, one answer to that is simply that the world is not very good at cooperation, that there are innumerable examples of insufficient or even utterly failed global cooperation in areas where it would be quite clear that global cooperation would be of mutual benefit if it could be brought about successfully. Now, in some of those cases, such as climate change, we see that not all countries have an equal interest in combating climate change. The producers of oil and gas, for instance, don't have as straightforwardly an interest in combating climate change as low-lying coastal countries that are not producers of oil and gas and exporters to the world. But that having been said, I think one can make a fairly strong argument that with suitable compensation measures and mechanisms, it would have been and could have been possible for the should have been possible for the world community to have arrived at approaches to cooperation in relation to climate change, which would have been at least more successful and more concerted than those that we have seen. So this is not the only case of the failure of global cooperation, and a cynical view might simply say that we are not very good at that. But I think that one has to look at the specifics of the case in order to understand exactly how and why it is that cooperation has gone awry. And here we have to get into a little bit more the specific chronology and the specific history of intellectual property rights protections in relation to health commodities, but also the growing private sector role. And let me say a little bit about that. I don't want to spend all of my time on the history, but let's spend a little bit of time on that and then move on to the current situation. I think that the broad context that we have to pay attention to here, and I'm not, of course, the only commentator to have drawn attention to this, many people have pointed to this, is the growing role of the private sector in relation to health especially in the research and development of new commodities. And when I say new health commodities, and when I say growing role, I mean in particular that the private pharmaceutical companies have increasingly been offered the reward and borne the responsibility of what we might call the last step or the last mile in the production and the distribution of health commodities, with government having ceded any rights and responsibilities in that regard. And here I am speaking of the developed country governments as much or more than of the developing country governments. It's important to make this provision of referring to the last step or the last mile, because, of course, even in relation to COVID-19 vaccines, many people have pointed out that quite a lot of the basic research and development which was required was done in the public sector. In the case of mRNA vaccines, for instance, which have been taken up as the leading vaccines, celebrated as the leading vaccines against COVID-19, the most, perhaps most promising and highest efficacy, and certainly the most innovative. These have depended on quite a number of years of public support for research and development, really up to the very last stage. Much of the research and development was done in public sector research establishments in various countries. And of course, in particular in the United States, where the National Institutes of Health and other public entities were instrumental there. So to the extent that individual companies such as Moderna and Pfizer have been celebrated for their role in this respect, it's because they have stood on the shoulders of giants in the form of prior public sector activity. Similarly, of course, with BioNTech, the German company which has worked with Pfizer and which really developed the vaccine which Pfizer has manufactured, which came out of university-based research, which was publicly supported. So we have a seeding of the ground, which took place over many, many decades, and one manifestation of which was, of course, the embedding of intellectual property rights protections of a strong kind in the form of the TRIPS agreement in the WTO, which created a reciprocal set of obligations to promote and protect intellectual property rights as conventionally understood and propounded. As many of you know, that was the subject of great controversy for a number of years, in particular in relation to HIV/AIDS drugs, and led to some modifications of the original vision of full protection of intellectual property rights from the point of view of private sector companies, specifically through providing some allowance for compulsory licensing of health commodities, and that again emerged specifically as a result of HIV/AIDS therapies and activism in relation to those. So we have a backdrop of deference to the role of the private sector, and I would say crucial in this is an ideology of support for the private sector based on celebration of the ostensible unique vitality, unique ability of the private sector to deliver. Some of you will be aware of the fact that Bill Gates played a very central role in persuading Oxford University to tie up with AstraZeneca for the, and of course, also with the Serum Institute of India thereafter, for the production of its vaccine, which Oxford had originally considered making freely available. And Bill Gates's influence in this regard, which has been reported on by various people, was largely grounded in his historic and very long-standing, sustained opposition to any type of derogation of intellectual property rights for any purpose. It's not, of course, a surprise, given that his own fortune has rested very much on intellectual property rights protections. Indeed, when India decided to join the TRIPS agreement, I think it is quite clear that the political economy of that decision involved a balancing of the interests of, on the one hand, the pharmaceutical manufacturers in India, which benefited from being able to produce generic drugs, and on the other hand, the software industry and associated IT-enabled sectors for whom intellectual property rights protections were important to embrace in order to ensure their continued access to foreign markets and their further development, or so I would at least hypothesize. So the tie-up between the IT sector, this connection between the IT sector and its interests and the pharmaceutical sector and its interests in terms of the larger ideology of intellectual property rights protection is certainly well reflected in this episode, in which Bill Gates is said to have personally intervened to have urged Oxford to form a tie-up with AstraZeneca. So that's again by way of the larger context, and crucial, I think, to mention, because if we want to look at the specific chronology and ask why it is that governments all over the world, certainly in the countries in which the major pharmaceutical companies were located, but all over the world, many governments all over the world, but certainly the developed country governments, were deferential, highly deferential, I think in retrospect, overly deferential to the private sector firms' claims and purported prerogatives. The answer is that this ideology was rather deeply embedded in policymaking circles and created a reflex which was extremely hard to overcome. Right? Let's think about the argument. And I'm going to focus a little bit on intellectual property rights, but then move on to other issues which include the requirements of manufacturing, which is, I think, crucial in the current phase. Okay. By the way, may I ask Chandan how much time I have? I'm afraid I've not been keeping track entirely. If you just give me an indication.
Sanjay, you have 20 minutes more.
Okay, thank you. So going back to the reflex, the argument that is, of course, at the center of this ideology is the idea that innovation depends upon the ability to realize profits through the monopoly rights, temporary monopoly rights at least, which are created through intellectual property rights protections by the state on behalf of private firms. Now, whether or not that argument holds even in normal times is an interesting and important question, which a number of people have discussed, and Arnab and I, among others, have been thinking and working on that issue, because of course there are other mechanisms. Professor Stiglitz, for instance, has written about this, along with Arjun Jayadev in Bangalore. There are other mechanisms which are also available to encourage research and development, such as prizes, for instance, public research and development support, prizes for private companies, contract-based incentives, and so forth, which would be compatible with making whatever research and development innovations arise freely available to the public. So whether or not these temporary monopoly-based patent protections are in fact the privileged, uniquely privileged means of providing research and development incentives to private companies can be questioned, and I think quite seriously questioned. But let's take it as granted for now. Let's suppose that that is the case. There would nevertheless be a question as to how to, in a particular instance, weigh the impact on future research and development incentives of overriding the intellectual property rights protections which are accorded in a given case against the benefits of doing so. Right? Now, economists have a concept of deadweight loss, which is a rather perhaps convoluted, not very charming, convoluted term for the efficiency losses which arise due to the existence of a monopoly, because monopolies tend to offer their products at a higher price and at a lower quantity than would be socially desirable given the actual costs of producing those products. That's the entire economic rationale for the existence of a monopoly, or the way in which it is that monopolies generate profits which are in excess of competition. In this case, deadweight loss actually involves dead people, not just a loss of utility, which is the typical methodology or metric of analysis of economists, but actually dead people. So it's rather ironic that that term is referred to as deadweight loss. Now, in that context of an unprecedented global pandemic, one might think that there would be a greater weight that could and should be placed on the present as opposed to the potential loss of future R&D incentives. In the language of philosophers, this is an act versus rule problem. On the one hand, the argument of the companies was that we must uphold a certain rule in order to generate research and development incentives. But on the other hand, violating that rule in a specific case could actually lead to an increase in the social good. And it's far from obvious when faced with an act versus rule conflict, which one should prioritize. Indeed, in the economic theory of these matters, there's a very strong case for prioritizing the act over the rule if you can make a credible argument that it's a one-off, that this is something that won't be repeated again and therefore will not diminish the credibility of the rule. Now, here I'm accepting their argument and providing a response which is internal, so to speak, to their own way of thinking. If the consequentialist case for research and development incentives is indeed that which is the one that we're being urged to listen to, that consequentialist case can be turned in a very different direction as well. Now, Arnab and I wrote a paper in Foreign Policy, again, quite a number of months ago, early on in this debate, in which we argued that even with complete compensation of the companies, which would be another mechanism that could be applied that would obviate any need for diminishing the long-term research and development incentives of companies, it would be well worth creating free intellectual property rights or freeing intellectual property rights through such a mechanism. We actually estimated, on the basis of some very rough arguments, that some tens of billions of dollars would be needed to compensate fully Pfizer and BioNTech for their mRNA vaccine, their potential profits from an mRNA vaccine being lost, in return for which these companies could be mandated to make their technology freely available to all. Now, I'm of course speaking about the global context here, and we can bring this closer to Indian issues in due course in the discussion. So the case for upholding intellectual property rights was always weak, but was not much attended to by the policymakers, again, because of the culture of deference. And I say this this was the case not only in the United States, but in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere. It's interesting that a number of countries with enormous technological competence did little or nothing to produce vaccines for themselves. They had compulsory licensing, of course, prerogatives under the existing WTO system. India and South Africa advanced a proposal to create a much more general exception to the standard intellectual property rights protections, which wouldn't require countries to apply on a country by country, case by case, and commodity by commodity basis for a waiver, but would apply it much more generally as a result of the pandemic. So even without that, they had the ability potentially to take steps themselves to manufacture vaccines, but they did not do so. And again, I would suggest it's because of this ideology. What did they do instead? they undertook, as we all know, advance purchases. And it's quite interesting that the United States is the only large country, I think, which was able to ensure an adequate supply of vaccines to its own population once they were developed, precisely because of the arguably China, but I'll put that to one side for the moment, and Russia, complicated cases for other reasons, but focusing on the countries where the private sector was most involved. Because these companies have a privileged relationship to this country, in which to which they enjoy a certain they possess a certain fealty. They were, of course, also making a business decision to prioritize supplies to the United States. The other countries were relying on the goodwill, and I'm not referring to India now, but to countries like Canada, Japan, for instance, which have had very low supplies of vaccine provided to them. They were relying on the goodwill of the companies with which they were making advance purchases, and also the hope that making those purchases early would put them ahead in the queue, which has not ended up being the case, which is why countries such as Canada, Australia, Austria, and others have made steps very late in the game to develop their own manufacturing capacity, only in the first months of this year. Okay. One of the major objections to the TRIPS waiver proposal, which, as you all know, was partially, at least, embraced by the Biden administration to great acclaim recently in the United States, and it remains to see how it will go, because the details will have to be negotiated in the WTO, and that could lead to a much more restrictive version of that proposal. One of the arguments that's made against it, the main arguments, is that releasing intellectual property rights is not enough. One needs to have the mechanisms, the prerequisites for effectively manufacturing that product, and that requires a great deal more. It requires adequate personnel, it requires machinery, it requires raw material inputs, and of course it requires know-how to bring all of these things together. And that it is said these are quite specialized, so that intellectual property rights waivers of the kind which are being advanced will not do very much to help. This has been explicitly argued by Angela Merkel in Germany, Emmanuel Macron in France, and others, who even where they, as in Macron's case, cautiously embraced the TRIPS waiver proposal after the Biden administration had signaled its own positive reaction to it, nevertheless also underlined that this was of secondary importance as compared to the manufacturing bottlenecks. Now, I think there's not much time left for me to speak, so let me move to that all-important topic, and here I will bring in India much more as well. What about those manufacturing bottlenecks? Arnab and I have been doing some work with some chemical engineers at Columbia University, one of whom has quite deep pharmaceutical company expertise and experience. And in the process, we've been learning a lot about exactly what is needed to manufacture vaccines. Our conclusion is that if governments had been thinking ahead at the same time that they were beginning to invest in research and development of vaccines to the requirements of the manufacturing process, there is a great deal that they could have done to alleviate the constraints to scaling up manufacturing, and they failed to do. So this was essentially a lost opportunity, whether because of cognitive biases or other reasons. It was a systemic failure on a grand scale. It's hard to identify any country in the world which really took full account of what would be needed in order to provide adequate vaccines for its own population. And here I'm including in particular, or focusing in particular on those countries with some pre-existing domestic manufacturing capacity or capabilities, but it's also true of others which could potentially have established that. What are the kinds of bottlenecks which could have been overcome? I won't get into too many technical details here, but suffice it to say that there are a few specialized machines, such as those which are involved in mixing different kinds of materials, for instance, mRNA in purified water, which are sophisticated and which require some lag times to produce, but which could have been produced if there had been attention given to them to that issue early on. Some of these are also already in use in other industrial processes and could have been taken over. We've seen some of that happening at a late stage, again in the United States, for example. The federal government has played a role in identifying such industrial facilities and taking them over for this purpose, but only in the first months of this calendar year. What about raw materials? Specialized lipids, enzymes, and other raw materials which are required do not similarly need very large lag times, but they do involve some lag times and could have been secured in requisite quantities if more attention had been paid to that. But it's quite clear that that doesn't seem to be the limiting factor. What about personnel? This is a more interesting issue. It turns out that the key personnel involved are those with analytical chemistry expertise who exist in a wide range of industries connected to food and beverages, for instance, as well as with pharmaceuticals. And with some retraining, they could easily have been provided the required competence. Most importantly is our finding that it's in the nature of the production of some of the vaccines involved, in particular the more chemically based vaccines, such as the mRNA vaccines, that there is a standardized production process which does not, to a great extent, depend upon organic production methods, but is purely chemical in nature. That's not the case for the adenovirus-based vaccines, such as AstraZeneca, which encountered some production variability as a consequence of the inherent difficulties and variability in biological production of that kind. But in the more chemically based mRNA vaccines and others, there is quite a lot of scope for standardized production, which means, in effect, that copying exactly what is the production process used in one facility elsewhere is a viable technique for producing that drug. Copy exactly, by the way, is a phrase which Intel uses as part of its own manufacturing philosophy in relation to its product, setting up facilities elsewhere which copy exactly what it does in a pilot facility as a means of scaling up production. So with governmental attention to the systemic requirements of providing adequate raw materials and training personnel, leaning on companies where necessary or providing them with encouragement to actively transfer their expertise, compensating them as necessary in order to do that, the production facilities could easily have been scaled up in a massive way. Now, in the case of India, we see a failure of arithmetic because it looks as if the vaccine requirements of the entire population were not taken account of, whether that was because of seroprevalence surveys, which seemed to suggest a higher level of herd immunity had already been attained, or a higher level of immunity had already been attained, getting toward a threshold of herd immunity, or whether it was for other reasons, for reasons of simple blindness, as I have argued may have been the case in other countries, can be discussed. But it seems quite clear that the arithmetical requirements of providing vaccines for the entire population were not adequately considered. And this seems to have been true in a number of the other large countries as well. although India might be the starkest case, insofar as it had domestic capabilities which it could have put to use. The fact that it had those domestic capabilities is, I think, underlined by the number of firms which have announced tie-ups of various kinds with foreign companies, Johnson & Johnson, for example, or others, but which are only planning to begin production late this year or early next year. And this delay was, I would argue, wholly avoidable. So we have a systemic failure in relation to the overcoming of bottlenecks and generating the incentives which are required, or cajoling, indeed, firms to do what was necessary. And we have an overwhelming social and economic case from the standpoint of individual countries as well as the world as a whole in order to have done that. So if it has not happened, we can only consider that to be a colossal and unnecessary deadweight loss, to use the economists' terminology. Now, I did promise to say something more about what could be done now. I've already indicated that there were things that could have been done before, and these are the things which still could be done now. At the level of individual countries, we really need to take a much more systemic view of what is the aggregate production capability and what are the bottlenecks or constraints which are involved. Some economist colleagues, Danny Roderick and others, have argued for what they call a diagnostic approach to economic policy. Well, here one would adopt a diagnostic approach to understanding what are the systemic constraints, lack of raw materials, for instance, which would need to be alleviated, doing the adding up which is necessary, rather than just depending on an anarchy of private sector activity, which is not aimed at that systemic result. It would also, I would argue, focus on at least one vaccine which could provide a public option. The public option would be the people's vaccine, which would be freely available, the formula for which would be freely available, and for which there would be also active efforts to extend the expertise necessary across the country and across the world. This public option, if made available, would in turn generate pricing pressure on the other companies to lower the prices of the vaccines which they are offering to the public. Going beyond the national scene to the global scene, and here I'll end with this. I think it's quite clear that the world institutions have failed. The United Nations has utterly failed to provide a forum in which there was adequate surveillance of the situation and a strategic commentary, let alone strategic interventions as to what should have been done when. The United Nations Secretary General and others are basically missing action, in my view, in this area, again, perhaps due to the excessive deference to the ideology of property, but also perhaps reasons. Both the WTO and the WHO have proved to be central to this crisis, but have shown a complete lack of coordination. And indeed, of course, there was no pre-existing coordination. The WHO had influenza-centered pandemic preparedness plans, which it encouraged countries to produce, but those largely neglected the possibility of other kinds of pandemics and certainly paid little or no attention to such matters as the requirements of producing vaccines and other health commodities in the requisite quantities. So there was a missing hinge between the key organizations, a lack of systemic thinking at the global level as well as at national levels, and that is still not being remedied. Recently, there was a report on the COVID-19 pandemic and the national and international responses, which was produced by an expert commission chaired by the former Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, which pointed to some of these gaps. But indeed, ever since the Stiglitz Commission's report after the 2008 global financial crisis, there has been a recommendation on the table for something like a global economic and social security council to exist, which would provide much more of the early surveillance and strategic responsiveness which is needed in a crisis like this. To some extent, and a very inadequate extent, that has been provided on an ad hoc basis by entities such as the G20, for instance, in their debt relief initiative in the aftermath of the pandemic for the least developed and the low-income countries. But they have not been addressing the issue of health commodities that we have been talking about just now. So, of course, it's easy to make a criticism of what was not done, but I think it's also something that we can learn a great deal from, even in the midst of this crisis, and certainly for the next one. Let me stop there. I'm sorry if I've taken too long. My apologies. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sanjay, for that panoramic trip through this very complex terrain. And I can sense your sense of angst, not just about the failure of policy and the deference to the culture of deference you kept reminding us about towards a certain sort of free market dogma or market ideology dogmas, but also about your own discipline and its complicity with a certain mode of thinking. And I've read your paper on how health need not be seen as something on which there is spending from outside, as it were, but to be seen as a constituent part of the economy itself, where each other's health is crucial for something like an economy to exist in the first place. So Sanjay, the question I have for you is, this entire crisis has allowed, there's a single focused discussion on the vaccine and the problem. And there are idealistic efforts on the part of the World Health Organization and the UN, however limiting and modest they might be. I think the Pope asked for the availability of free vaccine. There are these little some ethical sorts of pushes from here and there. Do you expect this to simply be a crisis focused thinking, or is it likely to lead to a larger sense of recalibration of the connections between policy and industry and international cooperation? That's one question. And since I know you care for cultural diversity, and I can't not raise this question, although it may seem like to be something to be not addressed right away, the question of medical pluralism, and has that emerged in this discussion at all in terms of managing this pandemic, non-vaccine sort of therapies, R&D on those things? Although, right now the faith in, the vaccine seems to be trumping, discussion of anything of that sort. These are two questions, Sanjay, but you don't need to respond to them right away. I'll invite the chair to offer his responses, and then we'll have questions from the audience. But thank you, Sanjay, for that superb talk. Professor Thorat? I don't see him.
And then we can wait for 2 minutes. I think.
Okay. Okay. So, Sanjay, do you want to start responding to my comments while we wait?
Thorat? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, he's here.
Yes, you said something to me?
Yes, I invited you to offer your comments, sir, to Sanjay's paper.
I think we should invite the views of others, member.
Okay.
Yeah. Sanjay Reddy can respond to your comment later. Let's ask other members.
Okay. The floor is now open to the audience.
Your comments can be responded.
Yes, you could raise your hand first and then unmute yourself and then ask your question. Alok, I see you raise your hand. Please. Alok Prasanna is a lawyer, a legal researcher, a constitutional expert who works with Vidhi Center for Public Policy. Alok, please go ahead.
Thanks, Professor Chandan. I enjoyed your talk, Dr. Sanjay Reddy. It was really interesting. One of the points that you made, I remembered something which I read recently, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. If I'm not mistaken, the rate of drug discovery has reduced over the last few decades. I believe the pharmaceutical industry is not finding as many, like in the sense of, for every $1 billion invested, fewer and fewer drugs seem to be reaching the market, is from my understanding of the situation. I wondered if that in some way has played into this pressure to protect intellectual property, even in the context of vaccines. Is it not? I mean, it's easy to say AstraZeneca is like this, that is like that. I'm just sort of wondering, is it an industry-wide phenomenon that the more dollars you pump into research, the lesser new drugs you're able to find, and that is sort of creating the pressure to try and lengthen either extend the protection for existing molecules, or to double down on even something like vaccines, which might be so important. I just sort of wondering what are your thoughts on that?
Chandan, should I wait for
Yes.
another question or go ahead and answer
No,
these?
please go ahead. I don't see any other hands raised.
Okay. So for the time being, thank you. So I apologize if I was a little meandering in my comments because I hadn't prepared a set of slides, so I may or may not have touched all the key issues from your standpoint. But let me start with Alok's question. I think that's a very important question, Alok. I have not directly looked at the numbers regarding the rate of discovery, but I don't doubt that you are right. And certainly the logic that you describe is the overwhelming logic as far as private companies are concerned in this area, namely to look for blockbusters, as they're sometimes called, right? Blockbuster drugs, where most of the revenue would come from a few countries, developed countries with larger markets in particular. And so the R&D process is from the beginning distorted in that direction. And that, of course, means that drugs where there's willingness to pay by a sufficient number of people in the population of rich countries these become the priorities. So it's not a surprise that there have been, therefore, some proposals over the years as to how to change the mechanisms, the incentive mechanisms that are faced by faced by the pharmaceutical companies, so that there's more attention to a wider range of conditions, of health conditions when they embark on R&D efforts. But that's not the problem we have here, right? That is a very serious problem. It's a big problem, but it's not the problem we have here, because there was already, from the beginning, a great deal of clarity that this would be a massively profitable opportunity, potentially, for the pharmaceutical companies, given the global scale of the pandemic, given that it does affect people in rich countries. In fact, so far it has done so disproportionately, actually, in terms of deaths, certainly, but also perhaps in terms of cases. So there is there was from the beginning a clear-cut profit motive to address this disease. Now, there is something that connects these two, however, which is that the mechanism which has been applied to provide access to poorer countries, to the low and middle income countries, to the available vaccines, is the COVAX initiative of the WHO and Gavi, the Global Alliance on Vaccines, and so-called Global Alliance. And that mechanism involves something called an advanced market commitment, which was so-called advanced market commitment, which was first propounded by Michael Kramer, the Harvard economist who won the Nobel Prize in economics, along with Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, as well as some other colleagues in the Center for Global Development in Washington. Now, Arnab and I have argued that this mechanism, whether or not it was appropriate for the specific purpose for which it was originally intended, is completely inappropriate for this purpose, COVID-19. Whether it was appropriate even for that original purpose can be questioned, but it's certainly completely inappropriate for the current purpose. Why? because the advanced market commitment idea is to create a market where there is none by providing a public guarantee of buying uh, the drug or vaccine once produced, once developed, thereby generating a research and development incentive. But in this case, it's not that there was none, there was one. There was such an incentive, indeed a very powerful incentive. And so the application of the advanced market commitment idea here not only did not fulfill a vacuum because there was no vacuum, it was also completely ineffectual, since the COVAX initiative has been trying to make advanced purchases of vaccines at too low a price relative to the others who are buying up those vaccines, in particular the rich countries that made massive advanced purchases at much higher prices. And ironically, the rich countries also claim to be supporting COVAX. So with one hand, they're buying up the available vaccines, or putting themselves in the queue for those vaccines at least, by paying high prices. And on the other hand, they claim to be supporting poorer countries through COVAX, which they are financing at a level that's insufficient to compete with themselves. So it's a totally irrational system, which had no economic logic, but which was nevertheless put forward because it was a scheme which had been developed earlier, and which had again enjoyed some influence with the global development policy elites, which, in our view, simply didn't think through whether or not it was applicable in this situation. So that is a connection, Alok, between the broader theme that you point to and the situation that we face here. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Dr. Sanjay. That was a very useful, that was a very interesting answer. Lot to think about.
Sanjay,
Chandan, yes.
we have a question that's been keyed in the chat box. I shall read that out for you.
Okay, and I'll get back to your question later then.
Yes. What form can international cooperation for equal access for all countries, particularly developing countries, take? What would a coordinated approach between the WTO and the WHO take? Can a quota system be thought of based on the based on the basis of needs of countries, especially the low-income ones?
Right. Okay. Well, there is some evidence now of a little bit of movement in terms of WHO, WTO coordination and international system coordination in general on these issues. For instance, and Arnab can speak more to this, the WHO has recently, very recently, I mean, far too late in the game, started to pay attention to the manufacturing bottlenecks involved, and in particular to whether or not something like a public option for a people's vaccine can be developed, which the WHO itself could broker. Of course, early on they had the idea of an intellectual property rights pool where companies would voluntarily vest their property rights, which could then be freely shared, but that enjoyed little or no take-up. So now they have moved to a bit more of a proactive, so to speak, a point of view on this as to how governments and international organizations can support the creation of something like a people's vaccine. They're not using that terminology, which could be scaled up everywhere. The question, though, I think, assumes that there would be a limited amount of the resource which would then have to be rationed, limited amount of the health commodity which would then have to be rationed. Is that the case? One discovery that we have had in the last decades as a result of the generic drugs industry in India in particular, but also in Brazil and other countries, Thailand and other countries, is that Canada, is that the scarcity is artificial, certainly over the medium and long term. Right? Economists have this distinction between short run and long run. The long run is where all of the constraints are overcome or can be potentially overcome. Well, in this case, certainly there are constraints in the short run. I mentioned, for instance, analytical chemists. There are only so many who are able to do the quality control tests which are needed to ensure the adequacy of a production batch. But there are lots of analytical chemists out there in other industries, or even in the pharma industry itself, which could be redeployed, and moreover others who could be trained specifically for this purpose over time. So that's a constraint which is overcomable. our core idea, and I didn't talk much about this during the talk, but I should mention it now. Our core idea is that it would be possible to create a people's vaccine by making it, in effect, accessible to all generic producers. That's the importance of making the formula available, but also of extending R&D, production assistance where necessary to overcome whatever technical obstacles are required, and perhaps using the copy exactly philosophy. To the extent that there are generics producers, these generics producers, by competing among themselves, are going to ensure that the health commodity, the vaccine in this case, is made available at the lowest possible cost, namely the marginal cost of production. And if governments wish, they can further reduce those costs. And indeed, there is a strong case for doing so. So I would suggest that we need not think about the global approach to this as having to involve rationing, but rather, or prioritization, but rather relaxing the constraint. Too much of the focus has been on rationing and prioritization. The COVAX initiative, for instance, had a very modest, excessively modest goal to cover 20% of the populations of the low and middle income countries. Why only 20%? When we know that herd immunity likely will require much more. Insofar as we took the decision to have lockdowns and not to proceed in the way that Joseph Mulail, the distinguished Indian epidemiologist, or others argued, for allowing the disease to proceed while protecting vulnerable groups and trying to achieve herd immunity in that way, we ought to have realized that a much higher level of vaccine provision was needed for herd immunity. Providing for 20% of these populations is neither here nor there. It's not a middle path. It's a nowhere path. And I think that this excessive level of modesty is because of the improper fetishization of or improper, I should say, self-limitation of focusing on limited supply, presumed limited supply, rather than on how the supply could be relaxed. And I'll just give you one little anecdote to make this just very vivid. Our chemical engineer colleague in our project pointed to the fact early on that the amount of mRNA vaccine needed to vaccinate the entire world, and this is true for other kinds of vaccines too, is actually, in terms of its physical quantity, extraordinarily small. He estimated that it could fit in, if I recall, a single railway car. Okay, so the quantities involved are not enormous. What makes the exercise difficult is that it, of course, has to be combined in a very expert way with fats, lipids, water, etc., and then delivered to people in a stable fashion. But the quantities involved are not large.
Sanjay, there's a question from Smriti Kopikar, who is a journalist in Bombay. I'll just read it out for you. She thanks you for your talk. She says the global vaccine strategy was messed up, or there was no strategy at all to ensure that all people across the world would have access to the vaccine of their choice. What steps would you think are necessary to ensure that the vaccine is both available and accessible to all? Because this seems to be an annual vaccine, is there a global organization you think should take charge, should take the lead, like the WHO, or is there a need for a new multilateral agency for doing this?
Yes, I think this echoes the earlier question as well.
Yes.
Whether it will be an annual vaccine or not, I think remains to be, vaccine requirement or not, I think remains to be seen. Without being too cynical, the private sector companies, of course, have an interest in its being viewed as an annual vaccine or an annual requirement, annual or semi-annual, because that creates a potentially massive profit stream over years or decades. And I think it is far from evident yet, what is actually the case, how long acquired immunities will last, whether those immunities are acquired by having the disease or by having the virus, or by vaccination. On the role of the WHO, again, I think it's become a little bit more focused on the production question. And I think this requires something like the Global Economic and Social Security Council, which I described, to really give it high-level priority, because otherwise the United Nations agencies and others have been excessively balkanized. they view themselves as having a narrow mandate. In the case of the WHO, focused on health, but also in a narrow sense, not wanting to step on the toes of others. The missing WHO-WTO collaboration in respect of this is one measure of the gap. The new WTO Director General has not been particularly keen on the TRIPS waiver proposal, and one must give credit to the government of India for having advanced this with South Africa. She's not been keen on that and has proposed instead a so-called middle way, but we have no idea what the middle way is yet. Again, I think it might be a nowhere way rather than a middle way. So I think there isn't a lot of appetite. There's still a lot of protection of and promotion of the individual sectoral prerogatives of the organizations, which is criminal, nearly criminal in the current situation. I should say, let me call it nearly criminal rather than criminal. Therefore, I think the lack of leadership at a higher level in the United Nations, for instance, the lack of clarity within the G20 or other ad hoc entities as to what is the direction being pursued, all of these are becoming even more problematic in light of this. Now, the pharma companies have I think, devotion to protecting their IP rights here, because the issue goes well beyond COVID-19 to their larger business model. And as we saw, even Bill Gates, who's not involved in the pharma industry especially, also perhaps showed hostility to this because of his larger interest. And I think, therefore, we do have to ask the question much more concretely, what are distinct mechanisms that could be applied? And this is one reason that Arnab and I argued for compensation. We didn't argue for an uncompensated taking, but compensation for at least one company to create a public option, right? Which is a modest proposal, actually. We're not saying cancel everybody's intellectual property rights forever. We're saying create a public option. But of course, that would also put pressure on the other firms too. It's interesting, just moving again just for a moment back to the government of India, that it has taken such a progressive point of view in the global scenario, not one, by the way, that it's used to taking these days, where it doesn't generally affiliate with other developing countries and it's stepping back from its traditional advocacy of developing country common concerns, but it has done so here. But on the other hand, in the domestic scenario, it's not applying a principled and consistent position. For instance, now taking the view that private companies may charge whatever they want, which is very different in spirit from what it's arguing in the global scenario. So I think we see a lack of leadership, we see a lack of thinking about that. Our proposal would be a public option, global public option, made available to all generics producers worldwide. And and going back to your question, Smriti, I think the WTO and WHO and other relevant organizations together could and should embrace that. And that should be the next focus of the campaign by Oxfam and others.
Yeah, Sanjay Reddy, there are many questions coming up. If you can, so that we can take more.
Sorry, Professor Thorat, did you say if I could be brief? I didn't hear the word.
Yeah, because there are more questions coming up. You can be brief, so that.
Of course. May I ask how much longer we have, just so I know to budget?
Yeah. Chandra Gowda, please coordinate.
Yes, the official end time is 4 minutes from now, but Professor Pramod Kumar let me know that we can stretch it by 15 minutes. So we have time, 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll just read out, there are 3 questions in the chat box. Sanjay, one is by a journalist, Shiv Sundar. He says, since universal vaccination is necessary to prevent any more COVID, waves from appearing in the future, can the world depend on the neoliberal philanthropy of the rich nations and profit vaccines to manage this outcome? I suppose the talk was trying to say no, but that's a question here. There is.
Yeah, exactly. Let me answer that immediately.
Yes,
Professor Thorat asked me to be brief, so no. Yes. I think that approach has already failed. And COVAX, the WHO initiative based on the so-called advanced market commitment, is the example of how it has failed. Yeah, not to mention how the various other examples in individual countries.
So there's another question by Tirupat. I forget. I can't see the whole name here in the chat box. But the question is, what's the argument in favor and against relaxing TRIPS rules in the global market?
Right.
It's a large
So
question.
very briefly, I think I talked about the broader themes a little bit, but very briefly, I think the key distinction is whether compulsory licensing or other derogations from TRIPS rules, right?
Yes.
Other variations from TRIPS rules should be only possible on a country by country, case by case, commodity by commodity basis, or whether there can be a more blanket permission. And that's the focus. The latter is the focus of the India-South Africa proposal, which is still under consideration, a more blanket permission. Now, the Biden administration has only indicated, in the US, has only indicated its willingness to pursue this with respect to vaccines, not tests and not therapeutics. Okay, so that's something one should continue to watch. But as you noted, in the end, I also recognize that intellectual property is only one aspect of this problem. We do need to think about the overcoming of the various other production constraints, and there too, government could be involved, should have been much more involved.
Sanjay, there's a question by a PhD scholar, Sneha Biswas. She asks, you asked for global cooperation in manufacturing and the distribution of vaccines. What are the lessons for India in particular in preparing for such situations in the future?
Yes. Well, look, I think India, we all know, I don't have to tell you that the government of India, rather, not India, government of India was assuming that the vaccines produced in India would be sufficient for India and for the world. And as I suggested earlier, that was a case of failed elementary arithmetic or a lack of doing even elementary arithmetic. I think trying to project adequately what would be the needs for India's own population would have led to a different analysis and a different set of actions than the government undertook, clearly. And it's very evident that there was a lot of domestic manufacturing capacity in related areas which could have been applied, but which was not being applied. You're in Bengaluru, you know Cipla, the global generics drugs manufacturer, which was central to the HIV/AIDS debate, right? And Mr. Abdul Hamid was personally very involved in advocating for a TRIPS waiver and related measures to allow generic drugs producers in India to export to where there were needs elsewhere in the world, in Africa and Southeast Asia, for example. Why was Cipla not more involved? Recently, just this week, we read that it has formed a pact with one of the foreign pharma companies to start to produce a vaccine here. Why was the government not more involved, as far as we know, in coordinating with Cipla and other manufacturers with existing capacity to produce on a larger scale, as opposed to relying mainly on two producers? So what are the lessons? The lessons are plan, have surveillance capacity and planning capacity. The government of India no longer has a planning commission. It has something called a Niti Aayog. Maybe you know what it does. I don't exactly know what it does, but apparently it doesn't do arithmetic. So I'm sorry if that's not a direct enough answer, but I think that it's not a lesson unique to India, right? Many governments have failed. I'm not making an argument only about government of India here. And that's also what our project with the engineers is emphasizing, that the systemic failure could be avoided through systemic surveillance. Pandemic preparedness in the future would involve creating facilities which are ready to go in different regions of the world, in different countries, with excess capacity that could be applied as and when needed, so that we don't have to face the lag times in production. Now, this may seem a little bit of a technicist solution, Chandan. I'm very conscious of your question on medical pluralism, and I don't want to overlook that. Okay?
No, we'll
because
come
that's
to
very, very crucial. So I'll just say that
Yes.
the focus on vaccines here is, again, a little bit of an internal discourse. It's not that I want to say that we should focus only on vaccines, not at all. I'm sympathetic to Professor Mulail, for instance, and others, as to what policies could also have been considered and how they could have been approached. But insofar as we're concerned now with vaccines, having produced lockdowns, which have maintained a high level of vulnerability of the population, having undertaken lockdowns, we should ask, how can we make them available as quickly as possible to as many as possible?
Sanjay, there's a question by S.R. Ramakrishna, who's the music critic and a fantastic translator. The question is, what are the prospects for India given the current pace of vaccination? What should we expect if no people's vaccine comes into the picture? I mean, it's a hypothetical.
Of course, government of India is now undertaking measures to step up vaccine production. Hopefully they will be successful. But I'm not an expert on some of the epidemiological issues concerned. But I think it's interesting to note that as you all know, the seroprevalence surveys which were done previously showed a high degree of immunities already in the population. But there has now been some speculation that that's because of the class biases involved. That, for instance, in Dharavi and elsewhere, there was a high level of immunity that appeared to exist, 50% or more of the population already, but that might not have been true for those who were more protected in the earlier wave, including middle class, upper class people, so to speak, middle class, as we use the term in India, and that might have led to continued vulnerability. That's one possibility. So one of the things I think we need to do on an ongoing basis is to do more such seroprevalence surveys and make sure they're more representative. This is another massive gap, something that government could have started to do early on, which it's not, as far as I know, been doing adequately. I believe the ICMR has done some such surveys, which I'm not wholly familiar with. Others may be more aware of it. But at any rate, to the extent that these immunities expand, I think we can expect that there will be a decreased vulnerability over time, as Professor Molail argued. And I'm hopeful from that standpoint that India may actually avoid the worst.
Yeah. I think the next question is by Kamini. It's a follow-up on what was asked just now. She says economists like Arun Kumar suggest that it will take at least until 2023 for widespread vaccination.
And then possibly it is the last question. Then we need 10 minutes for the chair also.
Yes. So how do you visualize universal immunization in India? And Beena Agarwal has a question, after which we'll invite the chair to share his responses.
Yeah.
Sanjay?
Well, I don't know what to say.
Question?
Let me just briefly refer to the one about Arun Kumar. Look, I think that could well be the case, but the point is that this is an avoidable situation. We all know that. Even now, I think the production process can be made quicker, and I would, in particular, focus on the copying exactly idea. Right? There's no need to have 10 different vaccines. It's sufficient to have one and make it as widely has reasonably high efficacy, and make it as widely available as possible to generics producers, to all comers, essentially, with adequate quality control assurance being undertaken by those firms that have the capacity in conjunction with the new entrants and as overseen by government. I don't know why the government of India is not pursuing that, as opposed to inviting new entrants to produce their own vaccines at the highest, at whatever prices they want to charge. Why is there not a generic option, a public option within India? Government of India doesn't have to wait for that globally. It can take the legal measures and the practical measures to ensure that immediately.
So Dr. Beena Agarwal's question is next, and then this is the last question, and we'll move on to Professor Thorat afterwards. She says, many countries, USA, France, Norway, have been sitting on large amounts of AstraZeneca vaccines, which they will not be using. What's preventing them from exporting them to needy countries?
It's a very good question. I think one answer seems to be that they are, those who already have possession of physical stocks are hoarding them because of the idea that they may need them in a subsequent round. That's one theory that's been advanced. I think, again, Professor or Dr. Acharya has more ideas on this as to what might actually be happening. But then, secondly, there are some technical issues which might be involved in transmitting them. I think Canada has said, in principle, once it vaccinates a certain share of its own population, it will start sharing excess supplies with COVAX Some other countries have, Norway, I think, has also said that it will do that, but when they will do that is not clear. And the "my country first" approach, of course, can be criticized morally and otherwise, even in terms of consequential efficacy, because there is an enlightened self-interest issue here, of course. Fundamentally, I think they have shown a lack of commitment of financial resources to COVAX, which has made COVAX almost useless. They have put themselves ahead of the queue. Many of them have not yet received even what they were expecting, and those that have certainly could share what they have. So thank you, Pina.
Professor Thora?
Will we close now?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's hand over to you for a thank and.
Yes. Yes. Professor, are there any remarks you would like to share before I do my vote of thanks?
No, it's okay.
Okay. Sanjay, thanks a lot for the
excellent lecture. Thank you very much, Sanjay Reddy. Yeah.
Sanjay, thank you. This is a formal ritual.
Please go ahead.
Yes. Sanjay, thanks for the fabulous talk. I'd like to thank the chair, the board members of ISEC, the life members of ISEC who've been in the audience, and all my colleagues and students and friends who have joined in this evening to listen to this hugely important, your talk on this hugely important topic. I would also like to thank the Registrar's Office for the support that it's made available to make this talk happen, and the tech team, the computer IT tech team, and especially Mr. Satish Kamath, who is behind here, making sure the whole thing happens without a hitch. Thanks a lot, Sanjay, again, and hope to have you on campus with us physically when the pandemic will have been lifted. Yes.
Thank you, everyone. This was very thought-provoking lecture Dr. Sanjay has given, and well moderated by Chandan. And thanks to the chair for being there from the beginning till end. I add to Sanjay thanking everyone, spending almost 2 hours. We look forward, Dr. Sanjay, as Chandan said, on the campus. We invite you for some interaction here and look forward doing some joint work in the future. I wish to thank the distinguished audience, distinguished guests who have joined us. Thank you, one and all. We'll finish it here. We'll come back with another interesting topic very soon. Thank you, one and all. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here, and Professors Kumar, Gowda, Thorat, and of course, Professor Agarwal and others, distinguished persons for joining. Thank you.
And also, thanks to your colleague, Sanjay, Dr. Arnab, who was with us.
Yes, he didn't have a chance to comment.
I didn't know when to intercede. Thank you very much. This is excellent talk, Sanjay. Yes, just one note is that the governments in their purchase of vaccines have agreements that stated that they could not be resold, and there are various kinds. We don't really know. We really don't know exactly what the contracts say, so they aren't really free to sell it.
I see.
Important.
Important, yes. Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you again. Thank you, Sanjay. Excellent presentation. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Hope to join you in person in ISEC soon.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks. I'm looking forward.
Thank you.